Good morning, everyone. For our next talk, I'd like to introduce Johnny, and he'll be giving us some of his insights in navigating zero trust adoption. Please give it up for Johnny.
Thank you, Billy. Can you guys hear me? All right. Is he on screen now? Oh yeah, there you go. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning, so hope you have a good day today. My name is Johnny. I'm a transformation architect for Zscaler, and I've been in the industry for a bit now, and I've been helping customer with transformation journey. Right, so I'm here to talk about this journey and what works for them, what works, what didn't work so well. So I think the idea is really to share experience. Right, it's going to be quite agnostic, so you can kind of apply this whole strategy even if you pick a different vendor, it doesn't matter. Right, so the idea is to be agnostic about it, right? What works if you want to adopt this strategy. I think it's a good thing for overall for the IT industry, right? So no harm sharing more, right? So here's the agenda. I'm going to talk about 3 key areas, right? So I'll start by recapping what zero trust is. I know this is a marketing word, right? Everyone heard about it, but let's look into what zero trust really is from a technical perspective, hopefully, right? And then we'll look at the challenges. Why is it so hard? Why is adopting zero trust that hard, right? And then we look at the stages of adoption, right? Like I picked a few stages. I picked 3. I know there's a lot of stages in the adoption cycle, right? But I picked 3 that really resonate, with many customers. All right, so what is zero trust? So I think one of the best publication, in my opinion, is NIST. There's a lot of definition on zero trust. Everyone look at it differently. Sometimes government look at it differently as well. But if I look at NIST, right, I think the definition is pretty spot on. And that's a document. If you go and download that document, it says, it's a strategy that evolved from a static network-based control to a resource-based, right? To a user to resource-based. So you're literally moving the perimeter from a network into identity, right? I like to call it identity-based perimeter. And then there's no implicit trust granted. So there's no notion. If you think about network these days, right? When you go into a network, when you log into a network, it's a negative security posture. What does that mean? Right? I would grant you access by default, and I'll block what's not good. So that's a negative security posture. Zero trust is about moving from a negative posture to a positive security posture, which is I will only grant you access to the resource you have authorization to. And the key there is really how do you identify this resource, right? And then authentication and authorization is a key component. I would think it's an anchor component when it comes to zero trust adoption. So if you think about like network segment and all those traditional architecture, it's not about using. You can use that, right? So I think here I am. I'm going to talk about how, to go from legacy to zero trust, right? So let's look at the difference. So if I were to put this in a diagram, right? If I put it simply, from a resource on the left to a resource on the right. In this example here, a user on a machine trying to access an app on the right side. So the user resource is sitting in the network for obvious reason. Right? In the network, you have the device itself. In the device, you've got the OS. And in the OS, you run the app. And within every app, there's a session, right? So that's the session layer. Okay, and then if you think about the resource on the other end, it's almost the same. I'll make it the same for simplification, right? And if you think about this, when you connect a resource to another resource, if you think about VPN, you're really connecting the network, right? So that's what you do when you use VPN or when you use trusted network. When I come to the office, when I log in to my machine in the office, right, the security posture is lowered because I'm in a trusted network. That's really common. And then there's this evolution of like, hey, maybe this is not a great idea. I want to kind of segmentize. I want to make sure that it's safe, right? So for remote user, maybe I'll adopt something like a VDI. So I'll grant access to a jump host to a virtual machine so that you can use a virtual machine and access another resource. And then if you think about zero trust, it's really connecting that session to another session, right? So if I map that into a blast radius, right, if you think about network blast radius, it's pretty big, right? Because you're in the network, right? And that's where you apply controls like firewall, VLAN. You put all those IDS, IPS to kind of mitigate that blast radius, right? And then if you think about VDI, all right, you got smaller blast radius, but when you jump into a jump host, right, your blast radius again is a network. If you think about zero trust, that's your blast radius, that session itself, right? So containment is much easier, which is why this is such a great concept, right? It's a great concept, right? But the adoption is like, how do I go from that negative security posture to a positive security posture effectively, right? And that's the biggest challenge, right? Sounds good on paper, but how do we make it from a marketing word into a practical adoption? And if you do it right, it depends on what vendor you go with, depends on what framework you look at. I think Essential 8 earlier was talking about framework. Here's another one of my favorites. So MITRE, everyone familiar with MITRE? It's a collection of techniques and tactics that's observed in real life, that is, that's used by adversary, a threat actor, right? So if you do it right, you can kind of close your gap, improve your security posture, based on which area you want to mitigate, right? So the idea is really now you're trying to reduce the whole exposure, improve your security posture, reduce your vulnerability or your open endpoint, right? That's what you want to do. So you can kind of map it to MITRE. You can look at if you use Essential 8, go for it, right? There's a few things that you can check off when you use Essential 8. Remember, zero trust is about authentication, authorization, right? So always start with really strong authentication, right? Like MFA is really good, but not all MFA are the same, so be aware of that, right? So I can use MFA that's SMS, it's not great, but it's there, right? Or I can go all the way to FIDO-based MFA, right? Hardware token and things like that, right? And which is really solid, right? So why is this so hard, right? If you think about network these days, right? I grabbed this diagram from the internet because I can't share a customer diagram, obviously, right? But this is something similar, right? You kind of see this in your environment. If you were to map out what you've got, network has grown over time. It started as an interconnectivity tool. The function of a network is really to route packet as quickly as possible from one resource to another resource. And over time, they say, okay, let's make this more secure. Let's segmentize all this. Now I need to extend my network to a partner, right? And we all know, right, like in the recent attack, if you look at all the recent breach in Australia itself, think about the last three. I'm not going to name it, right, but you look in the news, the last three, they all come in through supply chain attack. So all this third party, you should think about it. This whole concept is not just for your staff, not just for your organization. Go beyond that, go to partner. What about BYO device? How am I going to trust that device to work in my environment? So I had a chat to a customer once. I said, why would you allow BYO? I'm curious, right? And they told me, okay, if we say no BYO, they have problem attracting talent, right? Apparently Generation X, Generation Y prefer BYO, if I can't use my Mac, I'm not going to join you, right? So it is a real problem, right? It's like, now, how do we support all this demanding workforce, right? These days, things are changing. We can't say, hey, here's Windows, use it, or out you go. Can't do that anymore, right? And of course, then you start applying security layers, right? Remember that negative security posture that I talked about? You start applying firewall. You start segmentizing your network. You start applying NAC. Hey, I'm going to trust a machine if you pass a NAC check, right? And then comes SaaS, or infrastructure as a service, and then it makes it even more complex, right? So now, how am I going to apply the same control in the cloud? Can I lift and shift? Probably yes, right? A lot of customers say, I'll lift and shift, right? I'll put the same firewall, the same workload in the cloud, in Azure, in AWS. Does it work? Yes. Is it the best way to do it? Probably not, right? It's not the right tool, right? So then, then you have to adopt different tool set. Then you have all these tool set in your environment. It becomes really hard to manage, complex, expensive, and slow, right? And then when there's an incident, it is hard to pinpoint, to find the eyeball, right? So I'm going to talk about, and then if you look at zero trust, like this is what Zscaler do. This is our diagram, but you would see the same diagram from any vendor today, right? It's like having this central piece where every resource, when they want to talk to another resource, they just go to this center piece, and that zero trust, word exchange would then define and apply policy based on your authorization level, right? So if you think about it in this example here, I've got, let's say BYOD, or even staff machine, SOE, right? And I say, I'm going to allow you access. So if you're going to access, let's say, accounting software, you're an accountant, you're going to access accounting software, it's critical, you say, I'm not going to trust the machine, even though the machine is issued by yourself, right? Then you can do things like, I'll do browser installation for that, when they use that to access accounting software in the DC, let's say. But when they use the same machine to access Combank, to do their personal thing, or to do payroll, right? Combank secure is TLS, right? So you're like, okay, I'm not going to put that through browser isolation. I'm just going to pop that direct. And the reason why you can do that is because this model apply policy by session. It's not like you log in once and you have one set of policy for everything, right? It is policies applied by session, right? All right, so there's a lot of stages, like I mentioned earlier, there's stages in adoption, right? So when you think about adoption, there's a lot of stages, but these are the 3 stages that I think is quite critical from the feedback I gathered, right? So before this session, I talked to all my peers around the region and overseas and say, hey, what works for your customer, what did not work for your customer? And I combined that with our customer here in Australia. We're in a fortunate position. We have worked with many customers in this transformation journey, right? So we're grateful for that. So, we'll share this, right? Without, of course, sharing the customer name. So the planning is really important, right? If you think about this whole adoption cycle, right, it is really important to get sponsorship, right? And I know this sounds like it's so basic, right? But hey, if you think about this adoption and you go get sponsorship, right, it starts from your peer, right? Let's say a network group wants to adopt this whole strategy without clearance on security or desktop support and things like that. It's not going to fly. You also want some executive sponsor and things like that. So it's really important to get sponsor, right? My advice is make it a bit more far-sighted. So if you go to your sponsor and say, I'm just going to replace VPN, right? It's not going to go far, right? Because VPN use case is simple, it's easy to achieve, but the value, well, it's high value, but it's not really far-sighted because you're doing one thing, right? So you want to include a few things. You want to say, I want to eventually replace third-party access. I want to secure my OT environment. I want to make sure that I only allow authorized asset to access my, let's say, solar farm, things like that. So get sponsorship. It takes time, right? But if you get sponsorship, you'll be good, right? And then do discovery. Like I mentioned earlier, network grows over time, right? And don't make assumption here, right? This is where a lot of customers fail. They say, hey, I've got this asset, accessing this asset. It's really simple. It's not that hard, right? But hey, you forgot that you built this network over the years. There's a lot of shadow IT. Discover all that. Find out how they use the app. Do some survey, right? A good discovery is really important. Not just internally, right? Do discovery with your vendor as well, right? Because every vendor has a sweet spot, right? Is this a good integration pattern for you, vendor A? Right? And what's a complex or critical, or what's a tricky one that you are not so good at? Understand all that, right? So when you pick your vendor, you want to find out what they're really good at, what they are not really good at, right? You want to be clear. Most vendors are really open about that, right? Because you wouldn't want to sell anything that wouldn't work later on. It's not good for anyone. So do your discovery, not just inside. Do your discovery when you pick a vendor. And then, of course, if you look at certain blueprint, for example, NIST here. So if you read that NIST paper, it talks about having a control plan and a data plan, right? Then if you pick a vendor, in this case, it's us, Zscaler, right? You map them into that framework that you are going to adopt. Make sure it is actually compliant, right? Because you don't want to pick a vendor that thinks, it's zero trust, but then hang on, your enforcement plan is still based on IP address. You're still passing packet around. You're still exposing the IP from one resource to another resource. So that's not really what NIST is saying, right? So you want to map the vendor you pick into the framework that you adopt, right? I know framework can be, it's a guidance. You can adjust the framework based on your needs. Not all businesses are the same, right? But NIST is a good one to look at, right? And you can adjust accordingly. So that blueprint, right, create it has to be reviewed all the time. Right, I think one of my pet peeves is we have a blueprint and it never changes. Right, then you become a static blueprint that does not evolve with the landscape. Once you have a blueprint, it's always good to kind of have a roadmap, right? Say, hey, these are my roadmap. You cannot boil the ocean, right? It is really hard to boil the ocean, right? So you have to have an adoption roadmap. Where do I start? Where do I end, right? What's the hardest? What's the easy? What's the lowest hanging fruit? What's the hardest one? Which one has the highest win, right? So weigh that up and create a roadmap. So at least you have a plan. Stick to it, right? Of course, you can adjust accordingly, but if you think about, I put two things here, NSA and CISA. Have you guys read the maturity paper from NSA and CISA? I can really recommend that because it's really good when you read about it. It says, here's how you measure your maturity level, right? You cannot start with level, like 10, right? You cannot start with that high, right? So start somewhere, right? Don't aim, you can aim high, don't start there, right? You got to start somewhere and get there, right? So you to have that roadmap will kind of guide you through that process. And then the execution is also one of the really critical area, right? So think about execution, right? Pilot group is really important. So we have an engagement where a customer is like really excited about all this. They say, all right, I'm going to do all this, right? I'm going to put it on every machine to start, and that's a bad idea, right? If you can contain it to like maybe a set of user, to a set of app, that's the best, right? There's a customer who got really excited. They said, I'm gonna put this on our C-level staff machine to start with as a pilot group. We're like, nah, how do you think that go? Absolutely not good, right? Because then you have some teething issue. Humans are just averse to change. So if there's any change in behavior, if there's any change in the way I log into my machine, I'm not gonna like it. So that's human behavior, right? And you start at C-level, it's gonna be so hard to explain why you make this change, right? The coaching needs to happen as well, right, when you make change. So when you do this pilot group, make sure you have coaching in place, right? It's really critical. Policy enforcement, right? This is the most common point of failure, right? You go too hard, too fast, right? What that means is you're going to shift from that negative security posture straight up to a positive security posture. That means I'm going to start blocking everything day one, right? It is not going to go well. Right, this is the most common, and this is not anyone's fault, right? Because as your network grow, your shadow IT is there as well, and you don't see all that. And when you block all that, you may block a business process, and this is very critical, right? So, with any tooling that you choose, ideally that tooling can drop down to work more loosely, right? To work in a negative security posture to start with, and then you discover what is running across the machine. You discover the shadow IT. And then from there, you define policy, right? Don't go too hard, too fast. Don't go too strict, too fast, because it's going to be a stumbling block. And once you hit a stumbling block, it's really hard to recover. It's going to be really hard to recover. You can recover, but you're going to explain to 100 different people why that happened, right? So make sure when you do policy enforcement, do it gradually, right? Feedback is really important. One of the customers actually did this exercise really well, right? So they roll out for a pilot group, and they start sending out survey along the way, right? Like from experience perspective, how is it, right? What do you like? What do you not like about this, right? What are the things that you think can improve, right? So things like that really help. So you gather that feedback. Always gather feedback. Don't just roll out, you're in the blind. You want to gather feedback from the user. Some tooling will allow you to gather feedback on the system itself. For example, it can detect if the latency is higher when accessed through a different path, right? You can detect failure. So some tooling allows you to do that, but it's always good to gather feedback from your pilot users as well, right? And these are some of the areas that like when you come to execution, right? It's really, really critical, right? Because it is a change of architecture, right? It is quite a big change, right? And to change overnight is really hard. So the last phase, in my opinion, is the review cycle, right? So you would assess what went well, what did not go well, right? So when you assess what goes well, what doesn't go well, right, you'll be very tempted. So one of the common mistakes I see is, all right, we've got this whole zero trust thing. I'm going to make it work just like a network access control. Don't do that, right? You can do that for, like, let's start with that, but you got to plan to move away from just a network access, right? So a lot of tooling will allow you to drop down to negative security posture, which is fine, right? But don't stay there. Plan to move away from that posture quickly as possible, right? Some app, like I spoke to some customer of ours, right? If you think about, just earlier this week, I did a site visit, and we walked in the factory, and he said, okay, that's, OT network, that's a 286 over there. Remember 286 processor, right? I'm like, whoa, geez, that's a long time ago, huh? They say, yeah, because it costs $500,000 to replace that, right? So you got to cater for that. So when you do this assessment, like, okay, now how do I cater for that? You have to understand that's a risk area. You're willing to accept, maybe I'll use network-based control in the meantime. Until they refresh that $500,000 machine, you're going to apply some sort of segmentation at the network, which is fine. So you just got to understand what's practical, right? You have to be practical about it. You can't say, that machine has to go. The business has to stop. That's not going to work, right? But for other areas like remote workforce, those are the low-hanging fruit. Remote workforce, right? Workforce, so some customers even say, hey, even the users are working in the network, right? You're going to make that go away, right? Every user. So this is a really large customer that I spoke to. They're like, every user in the environment, 40,000 of them, right? Even if they sit in the office, they're going to connect through this zero trust model, right? So every user is like a guest user. They will put them literally in the guest network and get rid of the VPN, get rid of the NAC, right? And when they work from home, or they work from Starbucks, or they work from here, or in the office, the experience is exactly the same. It doesn't change, right? So you want to kind of assess all those models, right, and make sure that, hey, I can cater for every business needs as you go, right? Remember, that cycle is continuous, right? So you would then grow the pilot user, and eventually cover, hopefully, everyone. Right? But the thing is, this journey takes years, right? A lot of time it takes years. It's not something that you spin up as a project, you hit it and you go. It doesn't work that way. It is a project that go for years. It is a strategy change. It will take time. Update your blueprint, right? Don't have a static blueprint. It is always good to reassess, even reassess your vendor to see if it still fits the need, right? Zero trust change, technology landscape change. Right, is this vendor still fit for purpose? Is this architecture still fit for purpose? Are there better way of doing things? Always evolve your blueprint, right? Because if you get stuck in a blueprint, this is one of the biggest reasons why we have so many breaches today is if you roll out an app, you say, okay, I'm going to look at this checklist, right? Because it's from the blueprint. Checklist says I need firewall. Let's do that. Check the box. I need IPS. Check the box. Right, I need to have a fronting server in DMZ. Let's check that box. Right, it becomes a checkbox exercise. You don't want to fall into that trap that we all did, right? I came from network background back in the days. We all did fall in that trap. We're like, okay, let's check that box, right? Because that's the blueprint, and that blueprint hasn't changed, right? A lot of environments still have a blueprint that says you must have firewall in front, which is okay, right? But you want to review that to see whether it still makes sense. Maybe there's a better way of doing things like this. Right, and maybe years from now, there's a better way of doing things compared to this. You want to be ahead of that too, or you want to be in the know, right? And then you want to also update your roadmap, right? So maybe during your pilot phase, you come across some stumbling blocks, and you say, hey, I'm not going to, this is not going to fly, right? So this is, one of the things I want to share is there's a customer that runs like an ATM machine or some sort of machine. And it really depends on legacy technology, right? It needs to see an IP on the other side to be able to do a transaction. If you work ATM before, you know how it works, right? It's like, oh, I need to see resource 1, resource 2, IP pinning, IP allow listing is a thing, right? I'm like, how is that a good control? Because it's so easy to spoof. They say, well, it's been there forever. I can't get this ATM vendor to rewrite the code and pay them, $20, $30 million. It's not gonna fly. So you want to think about that and say, hey, okay, I'm going to create exception. Maybe let's roadmap that for further down the road. But in the meantime, I'm going to document risks. Right? This is a risk area that maybe we can afford to absorb today. You weigh out whether this is a good risk attack. Right? And then you may want to contain that risk. Okay, now that that's a risk, I'm going to contain it using traditional control. You can do that, right? So it's always good to kind of like You can adopt something, but you want to make sure that whatever you adopt can work with whatever you have in the legacy network, right? All right, I'll stop here. I'll just recap on the 3 key areas, right? Planning is really critical, so make sure plan. If you don't plan, you're planning to fail, right? And then when you execute, make sure when you execute, gather feedback, pick a pilot's user group, don't go too hard, too fast. That's really critical, right? A lot of failure, from our observation, is customer going too hard, too fast, right? They want to go positive screening model day one. It's not going to fly. I'm going to say, no, don't do that, right? We would, here in this case, we'll say don't do that, right? Because it's just a bad idea, right? And then, of course, you want to review, constantly review, and this cycle goes on and on, right? So as you grow your user base, as you grow the adoption, use base, the resource, right? You want to kind of review this and go through it over and over again, right? I know it went pretty quick. Yeah? I speak really fast from my, it's a culture thing. I speak really fast, but I'm going to pause here for questions. You guys have any question? Anyone in the journey of zero trust today? It doesn't matter if you pick us or not. Just want to see a show of hand. Yeah? Okay.
We've got a few questions in the
Okay.
app. So what data is stored at the Zero Trust Network access vendor's side?
Yeah, right. That's a really common question. So that's a great question. So if you think about zero trust, the platform, right? The idea is to be able to process traffic, right? In order to process traffic, sometimes you do TLS inspection, or many times you do TLS inspection, right? When you do TLS inspection, right, you look at the payload and you decide what policy you want to apply. Sometimes you don't have to do it, right? Let's say your zero trust is just to connect from point A to point B without exposing the network, then you don't have to do TLS inspection. So it depends, right? But a lot of vendors don't store data in the disk. It's always transient. It's always in the memory, right? So the data gets pushed out very quickly, right? So you want to make sure, this is a great question, right? So ask your vendor question like this. This is part of that discovery phase where you say, okay, what's your limit? What do you store? Are we subject to any additional compliance? Where's your data plane? Are they in country? Are they outside? Right? How do you secure it? Right? Things like that. It's a great question.
Another one is, can this be implemented in your own VPC without having to use a SaaS vendor, for example?
Yeah, so if I were to speak from our perspective, right, so I'm going to go into my vendor head now. Right, so if you think about Zscaler, we give you the ability to pull that whole Zero Trust platform, that's a SaaS platform, right, and have a subset of the processing plan in your environment. And the reason why we do that is because we understand that it is really hard for some customer to hairpin traffic. There's a few reasons, right? Sometimes you want to do that for compliance purpose. I need to keep my data in-house, right, for compliance. It's too hard to fight this compliance, right? So you can do that. Sometimes it's more like, hey, I'm opening a CAD files that's 3 gig big, and a 5 millisecond latency is not great because you're going to extend the file opening time from 2 minutes to 30 minutes, right? Then you keep that processing plan in-house. So from our perspective, yes, we can cater for that, but do check if you pick another vendor, do check whether they can do that because that's really critical, and that's especially useful when you do a universal zero trust, which means I want to adopt zero trust no matter where the users are, right?
We've still got a couple more in the app. So there's another question. Is Zero Trust a VPN replacement, or can you use it in conjunction?
We see a lot of user using in conjunction to start with, right? So sometimes, like that pilot phase I mentioned, sometimes you say, I'm going to roll out to maybe application A, right? But I let the rest of the app works with VPN to start with, right? So you can definitely work in conjunction. It is not ideal. It's not an end state that you want to get to, right? But it's a transient state in your journey, right? So that whole VPN going away is not going to be overnight, in my opinion, right? It's going to be working in conjunction.
Sure. So how can you do zero trust between systems that are all automated? So for example, an app server and a database.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to put my vendor hat on again, right? App server, workload to workload, right? The ramp on or the traffic routing is really important, right? So if you think about rampon, if you think about the most common rampon is I install something on a machine, and that app functions as a forwarder, traffic forwarding. It forwards the traffic to the platform. But if you run like mobile app, workload in the cloud, how do you do forwarding, right? So let's talk about the cloud. That's the question there. What do you do for AWS, right? So in the cloud, we can, Zscaler, we repackage that whole app that you install on the machine, and you put it on your gateway, and it will do forwarding to the cloud the same way, right? We also do SDK packaging. So if you have some app that runs natively as an app on your mobile phone, you can package as SDK, or you can even explore using SIM card, right? So we have partnership with telco, and so you drop the SIM card. The SIM card function is to forward traffic to the platform. So that whole forwarding thing, is good to explore, right? So most mature vendor will have multiple forwarding options. You've seen this before. You know how to support it, right? A lot of new vendor like I shouldn't say this, right? But some you have to assess this. Like some newer vendor that's SaaS only works in SaaS, right? Sometimes they struggle to do that, right? And we can still fall back to like legacy forwarding method like IPsec or GRE. You can still do that, or pack files. You still can do that, right? But the new forwarding method means you can install a gateway piece in AWS, in Azure, in GCP, and all it does is forward traffic to the platform. So when you have this east-west communication, it all gets filtered as well.
Do we have any other more questions from the audience? All right, please thank Johnny.
Thank you all.